Hi there. In the last video we saw how GDP was adjusted to take account of differences in domestic price levels. We explored the difficulties in compiling the data, and we saw how it could add an extra dimension of error to the national income estimates. Now in this video we'll see how international bodies use this data to measure poverty, and how some of them attempted to construct new measures entirely. Now, having invested so much in constructing the PPP GDP data, the World Bank was the first to use it to define poverty. In 1990, it defined poverty as the number of people consuming less than $1 a day at 1985 PPP dollars. Note first that the target isn't per capita GDP, because this would have had the effect of ignoring the income divide within a country. And secondly, the target is consumption, not output. Now, using this criteria, the World Bank estimated that 42% of the population of developing countries lived in poverty. Now, in 2005, it raised the poverty line to $1.25, now measured at 2005 PPP dollars. And on this new basis, it estimated that a quarter of the population in developing countries was now living in poverty. Now, when the UN formulated the Millennium Development Goals, it incorporated the $1.25 target at one of its indicators. It aimed now at halving extreme poverty compared to 1990 by 2015. Now, it should be noted before we go any further that the World Bank uses many more indicators than this in its work in alleviating global poverty. The $1.25 figure is a headline figure intended to grasp the attention of the world's public. But it's always been more than that. From the 1960s, from the development decade, it's been dominated by the GDP data and investment ratios. GDP numbers, modified or not, were mechanically used to measure progress on almost every front. And some authors argued that human advance shouldn't just be a question of GDP movements, but that human development should include other dimensions, like access to education and health. And in line with this thinking, the UN Development Programme constructed a Human Development Index, which it also launched in 1990. The Human Development Index is made up of three components weighted equally. The basis for its calculation has been changed frequently, the last time in 2011. Health was represented by life expectancy at birth. Knowledge was represented by the average years of schooling and by the expected years of schooling, to give some credit to countries introducing educational reform. And living standards were represented by per capita gross national income, adjusted for PPP. Now, gross national income is a variant of GDP, and its use was introduced in 2011. The effect is to widen the differential between richer and poorer countries, but it's much more difficult to calculate. Now, the UNDP has calculated HDI back to 1980. Between then and now, all countries in the world except the Democratic Republic of the Congo have improved their position, largely because of increased life expectancy. Looking at the global pattern, richer countries tend to dominate the top end of the spectrum, but many oil-rich Arab states drop down the order. The bottom end of the spectrum is occupied by the countries from sub-Saharan Africa, with one exception, and that exception is Afghanistan. Now, the Human Development Index is an extremely influential index. It's often quoted in the press and in academic publications, and it's often used by social scientists in statistical exercises. It's been savagely criticised, sometimes fairly and sometimes not. It's what we call a composite index, where different aspects are fused together to give one result. And indices like this are always open to criticism on three grounds: weighting, standardisation and selection. Now, on the question of weighting, the HDI comprises three elements, each counting for 1/3. But is this fair? Is GDP not overrepresented because wealth also determines access to both health and education? Is education not overrepresented because it's been driving the index forward and it takes no account of quality? And once you have the weightings, there's always a substitution game you can play. What is the trade-off between an extra year of life and a small tweak on the GDP data? Nobody, by the way, questions the GDP or GNI data itself. Standardization is always a problem when you take variables with different dimensions. The years of life, what, 0 to 90? The years of learning, what, 4 to 10 or to 12? And do we include post-secondary education? And per capita GDP, where do we start? Several $100s? Where do we end? All of these need to be standardized to fall inside the same range. Do you insert upper limits? Do you compress the gradient, a log scale instead of a simple number scale? And the answers to these questions all feed back into these substitution games. Now, the UNDP has been particularly sensitive to criticisms of this kind, and it's regularly altered the treatment of the variables employed. As we've seen, the last of these changes was in 2011. Now, criticisms on weightings and standardization are possible in all composite indices. And the UNDP has defended itself by pointing out that the HDI is simple and transparent, but it's always ducked the question of whether it adequately reflects human development. The most persistent criticism has been on the selection of the dimensions to be included in the index. What, for example, about human rights and democracy? Where is it? Well, to be fair, when the UNDP tried to do this in 1992, it ran into such a storm of protest in the UN that it almost lost its funding. Okay, well, what about inequality within nations? Well, again, to be fair, at the beginning the data simply wasn't available. It is now, and the UNDP has constructed an index showing the extent to which HDI scores are affected by inequality. It's not a bad effort, but it still contains many of the drawbacks implicit in the original. What about gender? What about real desperate dollar-a-day poverty? Well, in 2011, the UNDP also published 2 new indices covering each of these dimensions. Now, I don't want to be unkind, but to be honest, I would wait for the inevitable and absolutely necessary revisions before even trying to use these. Well, let's sum up now. We've seen how PPP calculations have been used in the description of poverty, either by themselves or in composite indices. We've also seen how the Human Development Index was constructed, and we've criticised it pretty seriously. Now, taken together, the videos this week have configured the world along different dimensions: population, output, income and poverty that are commonly used in our own configuration of the world into big, small, rich and poor, and a jolly good job too. But they're also implied by political economy analysts, all too often uncritically. This basic data is all too often slotted into sophisticated statistical models without pausing to ask whether it's suitable at all, and this surely nullifies the point of the whole exercise.